Hi everyone, welcome to month 2 of the Applique Club. Here's our sloth. Last month we used a layering technique and a straight stitch to create our panda. This month we're going to use layering again as well as a mosaic style, and we're going to build on our stitches. We're going to once again use some Sketchy applique, but we're going to show you a really easy 3-step Sketchy applique, and we're going to show you just a very simple zigzag applique stitch as well as a triple straight stitch to create detail. With our applique, we're going to use Brother embroidery threads. You can use your favourite type of threads, just make sure that they're good quality. And we're also going to use Resant in the bobbin, so you can either use bobbin fill or Resant thread. We're going to use size 75 machine embroidery needles as well as a medium weight tearaway. To get started, print out your pattern and follow the instructions to apply your applique shapes onto your background fabric. So the first stitch I'm going to show you is an easy zigzag stitch. It has a narrow width of 2 and a length of 0.5, so it's not quite a satin stitch. It's a very forgiving stitch and it's very easy to turn corners with too, so it's great for beginners. So I've got my machine set up, I've got my embroidery thread on top, I have my bobbin fill in the bobbin, I've got my size 75 machine embroidery needle and my machine set up with my width of 2, so my zigzag width of 2, length of 0.5, and I've reduced my top tension down to 3. So that's something you need to just test. So when you start sewing, if you've got any bobbin thread coming to the top, loosen off your top tension. This is what our zigzag looks like. It's narrow and it's small, but it's not as tight as a satin stitch. To start sewing, first of all, we're going to start with long threads and we're going to put our foot down so that our needle is going to start on the outside edge. I'm using a heart shape here because this has got all the angles that I need to show. Now once I start sewing, you can see the left swing of the needle goes into the applique and the right swing goes just on the edge. So not in the applique but just on the outer edge. There's a couple of rules with this kind of stitch is when you're sewing an outside curve, like on this heart shape here, when you need to stop and pivot, you stop with the needle on the outside edge. Just like that. The reason for that is that if you stopped with your needle on the inside edge and pivoted, you'd be opening up that stitch. So the rule is for an outside curve, you stop with the needle on the outside edge. As I approach the corner, the rule for an outside corner is you stitch all the way to the corner with the needle on the outside edge. You stop, you turn your work, and then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to lift the needle and you're going to just slide forward slightly so that when the needle goes back down again, it actually is biting into your zigzag stitch. If you didn't do that, what would happen is you would end up with a stitch on the outside edge of the applique, and we don't want that. Now I'm about to tackle an inside corner, or inside curve, sorry, and the trick with that is you have the needle on the inside edge when you feel that you need to pivot. Stopping and then pivoting. As I approach the outside curve, needle on the outside edge whenever I need to pivot. As I approach my inside corner, I'm going to stitch down a little bit past the corner, about the width of what my zigzag actually is. I'm going to stop with my needle on the inside edge and then I'm going to turn my work, and once again I'm going to lift my needle and I'm going to just shift forward slightly so that when the needle comes down, it actually bites into my zigzag again, and I continue sewing around my next outside curve, stopping with the needle on the outside edge. finish, just overlap slightly by 1 or 2 stitches and then stop, take your work out from the machine, slide it out, and we're going to leave long threads. To finish, just pull on your bobbin thread. That's going to bring a loop of the top thread through, and then you can hang on to that. Do the same to your other thread and then you can tie them off. I've used the zigzag on all of the large pieces, also his nails, his nose, and I'm also going to now stitch it around his eyepiece. This kind of zigzag applique looks best with a thread that matches your applique fabric. When you're sewing applique, make sure that you've always got 1 stitch going in and 1 stitch just going out. So basically the zigzag is sewn mostly on your applique shape. Next up is our simple 3-step sketchy applique. So to do this, I have attached my free motion or your stippling foot. That's the one that's got the little spring on it. And I have also dropped my feed dog, so I'm now in control of moving my fabric backwards and forwards. I've got my tearaway underneath to stabilize. And to start sewing, first of all, I'm going to show you how easy it is to sew these stars. So I'm going to put my foot in the down position, and then I'm going to put my needle down, and I'm going to bring it back up again, and when it comes back up, it's going to bring the thread with it. You can just use some tweezers there to help pull the thread through. And once I've got my top thread through, I'm then just going to put my needle back down again, like that, and foot down. Always make sure your foot is down when you're doing free motion work. And I'm just going to stitch to the point of the star first of all. Once I get to there, I'm just going to snip away my threads. And then what I'm going to do, as I said, making sure my foot's down, I'm then going to sew backwards, and then I'm going to sew forwards again. Because the feed dogs are dropped, I'm the one that's actually moving it. When I sew this, I always like to pivot my work onto the edge that I'm about to sew on. So I go 3. So 1, 2, and 3. And then I stop. 1, 2, 3. This means that I'm stitching each edge 3 times. 1, 2, 3. It's not a perfect stitch. We call it sketchy applique because it's like we're using the needle as a pencil. The other trick that I do is I set my speed control at a medium speed. So every time I start sewing, I know that my speed, the speed of my machine is going to be the same all the time. So you can see each time I'm sewing backwards and forwards, so it's a 3-step, and always spinning my work so that it's going to be sewing in the direction I want to sew. To finish off, I'm just going to sew a little bit onto my next stitches with some really tiny stitches. And then once again, you can either pull your threads through to the back. So that's the sketchy applique effect that you'll get around the edge of your stars. I've also used our 3-step sketchy applique on all of our furry bits on the slop. So now I'm going to show you how I achieve this effect. So what I have is my piece I'm going to sew, and I've got that facing in my direction. And then once again, I'll go needle down, needle up, bring the bobbin thread with me, use the tweezers, and needle down again. With this technique, I tend to sew about 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch in front of myself. So I'm just going to sew a little bit like that, and then I'm going to stop, snip off my threads, and then I'm going to do my backwards, and then I'm going to do my forwards, and then pivoting my work so that the direction I'm sewing is always facing me. 1, 2, and 3, and stop and pivot, and 1 and 2 and 3. Now your stitches don't all have to be exactly on top of each other. It is sketchy. And stopping at the point. Then I'm going to turn around, pivot my work. 1, 2, and 3. Now, please don't confuse this with free motion quilting. It's a very different technique. 1, 2, and 3. And then this time I'm going to aim to go down to my point. 1, 2, and 3. Characteristic of this technique is that you may get some little fraying edges, but it's very secure. 1, 2, and 3. And also wearing quilter's gloves with the grips can make it a little bit easier too. And now here's the tricky bit. I've got to do a curve. There we go. So now I'm going to use the same sketchy applique technique to sew the flowers just in the same way that I did last month. It's very important to have your tearaway stabilizer underneath your work while you're doing your sketchy applique to keep it nice and firm. I sewed the butterfly's wings in the same way that I did the fur, and now I'm just going to finish off with some free motion curls for the butterfly's antenna. You'll notice that I didn't go incredibly fast. I like to go at a slow to medium pace so I can really have control of my work. To sew our sloth's mouth, we're going to use a triple straight stitch. So most of you will have that very simple stitch on your machine. I've gone back to my normal foot and I've put the feed dogs back up again, and I've set my machine and I'm ready to sew. This stitch moves in a forwards, backwards, forwards motion. So if you feel that you need to pivot so that you can maneuver around the curve of the mouth, you only pivot when the needle is in the forwards position. Just like that. This stitch is actually a stretch stitch. It's a straight stretch stitch, so most of you will have this stitch on your machine. And when you finish, only finish with your needle in the forwards position, and you can either use a tie-off on your machine, or once again you can use long threads and tie them off to the back. Last of all, finish off the eye with the straight stitch. So use colours that match. We've used a black, a gold and a white. When it comes to the tearaway, if you're going to put your sloth in a frame, the tearaway can stay. But if you're going to make your sloth into a quilt or a cushion, very gently remove the tearaway away from the stitches. So here's our finished sloth. We hope you enjoyed this video.